So thank you all for attending today's event with Angie Kim and Lisa Gornick. We are Belmont Books, an independently owned bookshop and cafe in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we start, I want to mention a few events coming up that you can register for on our website, belmontbooks.com, spelled exactly like it sounds. On July 15th, we'll have middle grade authors Christina Soontornvat, I'm so sorry if I butchered that, and Erin and Trada Kelly, who will be discussing their books in support of our Read It Forward program, which promotes reading for kids in the Boston area. And then on Thursday the 16th, we'll be hosting a poetry open mic in which experienced poets and beginners alike can come together and share their original pieces of poetry with fellow poetry lovers. Both these events and future ones can be registered for on belmontbooks.com. And you can also purchase Angie and Lisa's books on our website, and I'll be sure to link that in the chat once the event gets started. A reminder that your audio and video should be off for the duration of the event. If you have any questions, you can send them to me or just put them in the chat, and Angie and Lisa will get to them if they so choose to, whenever they do.
We will.
Yes, they absolutely will. And also a heads up, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel, Belmont Books, at a later date. Subscribe if you feel like it. And so we're very excited to introduce Angie and Lisa, and I'll tell you a little bit about them and then I'll turn the event over to them. So Angie Kim is the author of national bestseller and Edgar finalist Miracle Creek, named Best Book of the Year by Time, The Washington Post, Kirkus, and The Today Show. Kim has written for Vogue, The New York Times. She has not written for Vogue.
Yes, she has.
Yes, she has.
No, I have.
I misread. Oh my God, my eyes. I can't read. Kim is one of Variety magazine's 10 storytellers to watch and has written for Vogue. There we go. And New York Times and the Washington Post, among others. She moved from Seoul, Korea to Baltimore as a preteen and attended Stanford University and Harvard Law School, where she was an editor for the Harvard Law Review. A former trial lawyer, she now lives in Northern Virginia with her husband and 3 sons. Learn more at www.angiekimBooks.com. Hang on one second. And then Lisa Gornick is I was letting other people in. Lisa Gornick is the author of Louisa Meets Bear, Tinderbox, and A Private Sorcery. Her stories and essays have appeared widely, including in the New York Times, the Paris Review, Prairie Schooner, Real Simple, and the Wall Street Journal. She holds a BA from Princeton and a PhD in clinical psychology from Yale, and is on the faculty of the Columbia University Center of Psychoanalytic Training and Research. A longtime New Yorker, she lives in Manhattan with her family. So, without further ado, I will turn the event over to Angie and Lisa. Yay!
Yay! Well, thank you, Emma.
Yes, no problem.
So, Emma, I would thank you to Madeline Day at Picador for setting this up for us.
Definitely. Yay. I love Belmont Books so much. Lisa, have you been to Belmont Books?
I have not, no, but I look forward to when we can all start to visit places again.
Yeah. I went there a year ago and it was just so wonderful. I loved it. And it was so funny because when I went in, I just got caught up in this conversation with all of these customers. They obviously have a very engaged group of people who just love the bookstore and who are just basically trust the booksellers to sort of, sell whatever books that they love. So I just love that about indie stores. So I just wanted to mention, for those who haven't been, as soon as it's safe and, everything is open again, everybody who has the ability to do so should go there. And thank you so, so much for having us. Lisa, would you like to read first or should I? Do you want to go first? You go first.
Okay. All right. So Angie and I are going to each read very briefly just to give you a little taste of our books, and then we're going to talk between us about some things we've talked about when we did a mutual interview when our books both came out in hardcover. but also some new questions that have come to us. So I will start then. An April Sunday, 2013. At Prudence's age, 3 weeks past her 101st birthday, the phone rarely rings, so that when it does, a little after 2, she is startled, only realizing then that she has slipped into a doze in one of the wingback chairs by the library table where she's been drinking the Earl Grey tea Maricel leaves in a thermos, always with the strict instruction, Mrs. P, you are not under any circumstances, not even Jesus showing up in this kitchen to light that stove. The phone does not ring most days because nearly everyone she has known is no longer alive. And for those who are, as she witnesses on her outings, talking as a means of communication seems to have fallen out of fashion. Hello, she says, disarmed, as she so often is when she hears her first words of the day. Hello, she hears back, a woman's voice, gentle, but with a backbone to it. I'm Grace O'Connor. The voice pauses as though aware that Prudence's breath has halted on the inhale. My grandfather, Randall O'Connor, I believe was your brother. Prudence does not blink, as stilled as if she'd met a black bear on a path. I think I am your great niece. There is no tacked-on silly laugh, and with this Prudence senses a grown woman, which makes sense. Her own grandchildren, had she had children, might have been grandparents themselves, but her own mind is not making these idle calculations now. Rather, wild, impetuous animal has leaped back to the day, a rare pocket of vivid memory, when they received the first letter from Randall, then only 14. A letter, it appeared, from the postmark that had taken 3 weeks to travel from his lodgings in San Francisco to Hell's Kitchen. That Randall had written it all had dwarfed the content of the letter, which contained little news, save that he was staying with Charlie, a boy he knew from New York, and that he'd found a job as a florist assistant. After her mother read the single page aloud, her father wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Well, he knows about flowers from me, he said, and her mother sucked her lips into her mouth, holding back, Prudence imagines. Go to hell, Eddie. It's because of you, stupid drunk, that he's gone. Her father had not been a stupid drunk, but when he did drink, he could get sloppy and mean, as he had the night Randall left. A night when he'd shoved her mother and Randall, who boxed at the place around the corner and had a quick right jab, made fists, and her father, who had never hit them, swung at Randall. Grace? Is that what the woman said? I'll stop there. So, Angie, let's hear from you, Miracle Creek.
Yay. Okay, but before we do, I just have to show off your beautiful hardcover. I hope everybody can see this. Yay! It's the peacock.
Thank you very much. And I'll show.
Piece. Okay.
And I'm going to show Angie's. And we actually had the same book designer at Forest Ross and Giroux, so that's why they look kind of similar.
You think they look similar? I think they look so different. Really?
Something about the way the colors are against the
maybe.
black background. And
Yeah. Okay. So thank you everyone again. And so Miracle Creek is a literary courtroom drama about a Korean immigrant family and a young single mother who's on trial for murdering her 8-year-old son with autism. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the first page. The incident, Miracle Creek, Virginia, August 26, 2008. My husband asked me to lie. Not a big lie. He probably didn't even consider it a lie, and neither did I at first. It was such a small thing what he wanted. The police had just released the protesters, and while he stepped out to make sure they weren't coming back, I was to sit in his chair, cover for him, the way coworkers do as a matter of course, the way we ourselves used to at the grocery store, while I ate or he smoked. But as I took his seat, I bumped against the desk, and the certificate above it went slightly crooked, as if to remind me this wasn't a regular business, that there was a reason he'd never left me in charge before. Pock reached over me to straighten the frame, his eyes on the English lettering. Pock U, Miracle Submarine, LLC, certified hyperbaric technician. He said, I still on the certificate as if talking to it, not to me. Everything's done. The patients are sealed in. The oxygen's on. You just have to sit here. He looked at me. That's it. I looked over the controls, the unfamiliar knobs and switches for the chamber we painted baby blue and placed in this barn just last month. What if the patients buzz me? I said. I'll say I'll be right back, but if something goes wrong and what could go wrong? Hawk said, his voice forceful like a command. I'll be right back and they won't buzz you. Nothing will happen. He walked away as if that was the end of the matter, but at the doorway he looked back at me. Nothing will happen, he said again, softer. It sounded like a plea. As soon as the barn door banged shut, I wanted to scream that he was crazy to expect nothing to go wrong on this day of all days when so much had gone wrong. The protesters, their sabotage plan, the resulting power outage, the police. Did he think so much had already happened that nothing more could? But life doesn't work like that. Tragedies don't inoculate you against further tragedies, and misfortune doesn't get sprinkled out in fair proportions. Bad things get hurled at you in clumps and batches, unmanageable and messy. How could he not know that after everything they'd been through? I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Angie.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So let's talk about our books. So I need to say, first of all, that we have the same editor, and we obviously the same publisher as well. We have, FSG in common, and we also have Sarah Crichton, who was our editor for both of our books, as well as the same cover designer. And I feel like it's so funny to me that your book and my book are categorized differently. Yours is historical fiction, and mine is sort of murder mystery, courtroom drama, whatever. And yet I feel like they have the same sensibility and they share the same emotional core. And we did this conversation, as you said, back in last year when our books were both coming out in the hardcover in the spring of 2019. And we talked about this. We talked about how it's interesting that they both have this core of, just if one little thing had happened differently than the tragedy that sort of happens to the characters throughout the novel might not have occurred. So there is that kind of emotional core and that thematic core that I think appeals to both of us. And there's also the fact that mine is a sort of a legal mystery, and yet you as a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, had really noticed some of the psychological insights that my characters have had about shame and sort of the reasons why they did certain things. And then your book, with you being written by a psychotherapist with, appearances from Freud and the like, that I noticed this sort of mystery and even legal core. There is like stuff about the capital punishment in Texas, and there's also this suspense thread that to me really surprised me, because this is not a spoiler for anybody who hasn't finished the book, but at the end there was this amazing sort of suspenseful, mysterious twist as to something that happens to the characters that to me, like the mystery lover that I am, really appealed to me. So I wanted to sort of like throw that out there as something that, binds our books and us together. And I think one of the reasons why we've become such close friends since I reached out to you as like a novice, and I was like, Lisa, will you please help me? I want to know what to expect from this whole like FSG publication thing, because you were the veteran author that I was looking to as a debut, and we've become such good friends, and I think that's one of the reasons why. So anyway, so that's my take on it. So you take it away. What do you think?
Okay. Well, thank you, Angie. And it's been a delight to get to know you too. And one of the very first times I realized that we were completely sort of tuned in to each other on an unconscious level was when I said to you, you know, your book reminds me of the structure of The Sweet Hereafter by Russell Banks. And you went, oh my God, that's exactly what I had in mind. And you told me that your original first sentence actually had the rhythm from that book, The Sweet Hereafter. But just to come back to your question, I think one of the things that we share is that we both had other careers first. You as a trial attorney and a litigator, and of course that is very much comes into play in your book, and me as a psychoanalyst. But it was very interesting to me when you first read the book, my book, and told me that what you keyed into was the suspense, because what I had keyed into in your book was the psychological acuity. And it made me wonder about the commonality between our past professions and how we both brought that into our writing. And we talked about this a little bit earlier this week when we were chatting, that as a trial attorney, you really had to develop a story and you had to allow it to unfold in a way that was psychologically convincing to a jury. And that's one of the great charms of your book, is that you see this Shannon, who's the litigator, you get to watch her in motion, and I really enjoyed that. And after we spoke, it occurred to me that as an analyst, when I was working as an analyst, which I'm not doing any longer, that I also had to work with a patient to create a story that helped them to be able to better understand their lives, and that there often was a lot of suspense in the creation of that kind of story, because you really don't know as you're starting out, like what the important elements are going to be. And I know when we talked about your writing your book, you told me that you really didn't know at first who had committed the crime, and that was something that evolved for you. And that's the same for when you're working with a patient, that you really don't know what are going to be the most important and salient factors. So I think that we both brought a kind of familiarity with the way stories unfold and get crafted, and the patience that you need to take with them if they're going to be complicated. That you have to allow yourself to not know what's going to happen for a good long while. And we both brought that to our work and the kind of novels that we wrote. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that I'm not sure that I've used this word before, but I think the one sense that sort of both of our previous careers have, have attracted to us is this element of curiosity. And I think that's what novelists have to do as well, and storytellers, is that, I certainly had to be curious about what are the motivations and what is, the answer that I'm going to get from, looking through all of these documents and whatever, and interviewing all of these people about the events that form the center of this trial and this conflict. And same with you, I think, right, with respect to your patients, you had to really sort of you had to be curious about what their motivations are, as well as where that story was going to take you and what the root of that story is. And I think that's what we have to do as storytellers, and in those who can, like you did this so marvelously, is by weaving through all of the three timelines that you have, you were able to keep and maintain our interest and make us curious about all of the family's stories throughout those timelines. And I think that that's what made your novel such a page turner for me, was that it just made me, I started out with a curiosity as to what was happening, and then I kept on going, further and further. And being able to maintain that, I think, is a skill, and I think it's a skill that you probably have learned a lot from being a successful, psychoanalyst.
Well, thank you again, Angie. But I think, in a way, another thing that we share is that we're both used to having to put in a huge amount of hard work. And so one of the things that I was struck with when I read your book was how mind-boggling it was, the threads that you were juggling. So I actually wrote them down. You have the question of what actually happened. So Angie's book starts, and this is not a spoiler because this happens in the very first chapter, with an explosion. So the hyperbaric oxygen tent, the submarine, explodes, and 2 people die, and a number of other people are injured. So there's the question of what happened? How did that happen? And then you have the other question, which are the steps that are taken to cover up what happens. And that's threaded throughout Angie's book. And then is the question of the unfolding of all of these different characters understanding themselves of what happened. So each person, each character thinks something different happened. And then there's the trial, in which there is the unfolding of the evidence and the attempt to make an argument. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes that is just meant to mislead somebody. And so she has all of these vectors moving forward. It's really mind-boggling. I wondered if you had to take a lot of Advil when you were writing. And how did you keep it all straight for you?
Well, and I said the same thing for you with your timelines. But for me, I did not. It's funny because I was writing a mystery. And yet it didn't really occur to me that I had to know the answer to the mystery of who set the fire or why or how, which are sort of the central questions, until the end, until I got to that part. And so, and I'm not sure that I told you about this, Lisa. This is a relatively recent discovery that I made. I realized in going through my files for Miracle Creek and sort of archiving them, both the physical files and the electronic ones, that I had this file that was one of the first things that I wrote to myself. And it was something that and I put in all caps, "This is not a novel." And so because this is my debut novel, I told myself, it's okay that I don't know what happened. It's okay that I have no clue, who set the fire or what happened or how any of these threads are going to actually come together, or if they're going to actually become a coherent whole at some point, because this is not a novel. So I told myself, literally, I had a file where I put to myself, this is not a novel. This is just an exercise that I'm doing. This is how I'm learning. This is not an actual book. It's never going to see the light of day. And, this is going to be my practice book where I write it and then I put it away in my drawer and never look at it again. So it's okay. So I gave myself sort of an excuse for not having the answers before I actually started writing. So I think I just wrote sort of organically whatever's happening. And then it wasn't until I was actually done with the first draft that I started thinking, okay, what do I have here? And then outlining what I had already written, and then revising the outline and reading all the craft books that tell you about novel structure and what's supposed to happen in novels and all sorts of things, and then going from there. So you're the psychoanalyst, but I sort of think that I had it easy in that sense, in that I didn't have any pressure to sort of try to make it. And I could just be like, okay, I have no idea what's happening. I have no idea who set this fire, and it's okay that I don't, And so I allowed myself to go all over the place. But I wonder for you though, because this is not your first novel. You knew that this was going to see print, and I just wondered a little bit about sort of all of these threads that you have. Your novel spans 10 years or something. I forget.
101, yeah.
Right. So, and there are so many different threads, and there are so many different flashbacks to different timelines and how they sort of all, and they do come together. And so I wanted to know from that, and also sort of the really cool mystery that threads throughout that we get to, find out about at the end. Did you have all of that planned out? Would love to know what your process is like vis-a-vis those types of things.
It's such a long time ago that I started this book that it's probably half fiction for me to answer that. But like you, I have a long period of in which I don't consider myself, quote, writing. So I'm thinking about the book. And so for me, the core that I started with was the idea of an older woman and a great niece who she had never met before, and this confrontation, this time that they spend together. So I began with that. And it was while I was in the middle of thinking about that I happened by chance to stumble into this exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum. And this is a long time ago. I believe it was in the early winter of 2008. And the exhibit was about Laurelton Hall and about Tiffany's Laurelton Hall. And I had never been a particular fan of his work. So I went in kind of
This is the Tiffany lamps and things like that, right? Just so people know. Yeah.
So I went in, and as soon as I began to look at this exhibit, I realized that my thinking about him had been quite wrong. And somebody did ask, I'm not reading the chat as we're talking, but a little bit about my take on Louis C. Tiffany. And the first piece of what happened when I was at that exhibit was I realized that he really was a genius. It was this extraordinary this piece of architecture that he had designed himself, the gardens. It was on 588 acres, and it was this potpourri of all of these different architectural styles influenced by the Orient, as well as Art Deco and all of these collections and things. But what really stopped me in my tracks was this photograph of the Peacock Feast, which for those of you who have the book.
Here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're holding it up.
And
so,
you guys
yes,
see it?
Exactly. And so here are these five young girls.
I love this so much. Yeah.
And this happened in 1914, and they are dressed in these Grecian togas. And this is from the New York Times, which covered the event. And I'm not going to waste our time going into what the event was. It's really quite fascinating. But when I realized that three of the girls were his daughters, I became obsessed with having to learn who he was, how those girls had experienced that event, in which they were paraded in front of 150 men of, quote, genius. And for me, the kicker was when I realized and learned that the girl who was in the middle was a woman who I already knew about. Her name was Dorothy Burlingham. I never knew that she was Louis C. Tiffany's daughter, but in fact, she was his youngest daughter. And the way that I knew her was that she was Anna Freud's partner in work and probably love for both of their lives for over 50 years. So when I put all of those pieces together, that led me down this whole other track. And that took a long time to do that research and to learn enough about what their lives were. And then the third thread for me of this book is Prudence, who you met when I did the reading. She's 101, and that she'd had a brother who she lost touch with many, many years before, when she was like 14 years old. So that was the third thread of the book. But Angie, because we're going to run out of time, I'm going to actually switch gears, and I want to ask us I want to ask us to talk about another question. I'm going to read this little quote. The novelist Ron Hansen takes his friend Russell Banks, whose sweet hereafter we both admire and was so important to you in deciding on your structure for Miracle Creek, to task for the liberties he took in his historical novel Cloud Splitter about abolitionist John Brown. because, and here I'm quoting Ron Hansen, he maintained that his obligation to history was negated as soon as he called the book a novel. And Hansen then quotes a law professor. He taught a class at Santa Clara University with law professor Ken Manister. To deceive people about what was not only is disrespectful, but also undermines our collective conversation. So this was clearly an issue that I had to contend with in writing historical fiction, but
Of course,
it occurred to me when I reread this quote recently that perhaps it was also relevant for you because you were writing about real communities of people. You were writing about, first of all, the H-spot, the treatment that you knew a bit about from your own life. You were writing about communities of special needs children and what those families are like, and you were writing also about Korean immigrants. And I'm wondering how obligated you felt to hew to the truth and how you thought about all of those issues.
Yeah, this ethics of fiction is so, it's so interesting to me, and obviously it has so much relevance to historical fiction, just because you do have to sort of think about, what's authentic and what's not. And I did. I mean, this is something that I had to deal with, and I think everybody has to deal with. And we've, had lots of conversations recently about sort of, cultural and, other types of appropriation questions and things like that. So it's definitely something that I had to deal with. And I think that in a way, I got off a little bit easy in the sense that because this is my first novel and because I do believe that there is this, we do have a tendency to put ourselves, a lot of our own lives personally, into our first novels. And I certainly did that with my book. So there's, the immigrant thread, and the immigrant family in Miracle Creek is basically my family when I came over with my parents as a preteen. The HBOT, the hyperbaric oxygen therapy experimental group of patients, is basically something that I was part of here in Northern Virginia. This HBOT group of parents who were dealing with their children who had chronic illnesses and special needs and things like that. And I had a child with ulcerative colitis that I was doing HBOT, this experimental treatment for, so I was part of that group. And, and then the third thread that sort of underlines all of that, which is this legal, the courtroom drama thread, because I had been a trial lawyer, I wanted to also sort of use those dynamics that I had witnessed myself in the courtroom. So I think in a way I had it easy for this particular one, in that all the experiences that I drew upon were things that were authentic to me and things that I really felt so genuinely curious about, and stuff that I had a lot to say about. And so I think in that sense, even though I had to be careful to make sure that the experiences I chose to highlight were not sort of anything that went against any of those types of experiences, I felt pretty comfortable speaking about them because I myself had been a participant in all of those types of experiences. And I think where and there are obviously things like, I had to simplify some of the issues. I had to simplify a lot of the trial court, the courtroom mechanics and things like that to make it more palatable to a fiction audience. And, so that brought up some issues for me that I had to contend with and make sure that people were going to be happy with, and, all of that sort of stuff. But I think that's all minor. I think the heart of the issue for me was that because I experienced all of these things myself, I felt like I did have a right to, in some way, to sort of speak about them. And even though it wasn't going to be exactly the same experience that other people in a similar situation had, that I felt like my experience was authentic and that I felt okay about sharing them. Whereas I do wonder, and I think this gets to the question that was brought up in the chat by Edward. Was it Edward? Yeah, about this, thing of, you're dealing with real life people that you didn't necessarily know or, have a strong, intimate connection with yourself in writing historical fiction. And I wonder what you thought about sort of the ethics of fiction and how that relates to you and your research and, and this question from Edward of, did you have any concern of being sued for libel by the estate of Tiffany because of the way that, he was portrayed in your novel and all of that sort of stuff? So, yeah, I think it's such an interesting question, and I am so interested to hear what you have to say about your novel, because I feel like historical fiction especially is just so, ripe for that discussion.
Well, first of all, I never thought about my book as historical fiction because,
Which is so
as you
funny,
said,
right? Yeah.
This is my fourth novel. None of the others had been called historical fiction. This book, as you said, has 3 threads. One of them takes place in a week in 2013, so that's the spine of the book. The other thread of Prudence's life, it's true, it starts with her first memory, which is the Peacock Feast, which is in 1914, but she's still alive today. We go through her entire life. So to that extent, yes, it does span a century of American history. The third strand, which is her great niece, she is born in 1970 in a commune in Northern California. So Rebecca Mackay and I have had this discussion about, like, where does historical fiction start? It's 1970s, is that historical fiction? And
Right.
But really only a third of it takes place before actually 1980. But to come back to this question, Hilary Mantel, who is probably a name familiar to many of you for Wolf Hall, her epic book, she wrote something that I agree with, which is that she said, if she knows that something happened in the historical record, she always abides by it. So if Thomas Cromwell was in a particular date in France, in her novel, he has to stay in France. And it never, because I had not written historical fiction before, it never occurred to me that there was ever any other choice. That everything that I wrote had to, in my mind, stick with what I knew, with what I understood. So I read a great deal about the Tiffany family, as much as I could, and a great deal about his work and the era. And then when I moved to the 1970s, that I already knew a bit about from personal experience, but the communes in Northern California, I did a lot of research. I went out and visited some of them. Tiffany himself is a little bit like Stone Soup. People have asked me this question. In fact, he is not in the novel at all. And he makes one walk-on appearance in which somebody sees him out of the corner of their eye, a character, and he never says a word. So everything that is in the novel is through the experience of his daughter, what she has to say about him. There, I stayed very close to the biography and what she reported to others. There is a question of whether he did something nefarious in the book. Now, and I'm not going to say what it is, but on her deathbed, Prudence's mother, not Prudence, her mother, says something that implies that she felt in some way very deeply wronged by Louis C. Tiffany. And it is up to the reader to decide whether that is a report that you believe, that you think is induced by laudanum, which you go on at the time, or whether, and here I'm putting on my psychoanalyst hat, whether it's a kind of cover memory for a fictional trauma that happens in the book. Now, so here, this is quite complicated. Louis C. Tiffany, in truth, in reality, in 1916, exploded. He had his workers place dynamite under a breakwater that was outside his mansion. This is part of the legal record, actually.
Yeah, and that's part of the book,
it really,
right? Yeah.
It really happened, and he did this. And he had been in suits and lawsuits with the town of Oyster Bay for 7 or 8 years because the town wanted to reclaim as riparian rights. You know what they are, Angie, but I didn't before this. But there actually was a legal article by a lawyer that I read, a historical account of this. The town was trying to reclaim the beach that was in front of his estate because it had been a very popular bathing spot for the local townspeople. He did not want to give up the beach in front of his home. So what he decided to do was to blow up the breakwater, which basically destroyed the beach. So he sabotaged it. So that's the true event. In the book, something happens to the family of Prudence. That's obviously fictional. They're not real people. So what I was dealing with in my novel were often interactions between fictional characters and real personages. And for me, where the ethics held was that I felt that whatever I depicted about a real character, someone who really lived, had to be in line with my honest and genuine and best understanding of them. And this came most into play for me with Dorothy Burlingham, who is his daughter, and who, in the very end, I actually read many of her letters at the Freud Museum and felt that I had accurately captured her voice and sensibility.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. No. So answer to the question. Did you think that there was anything, not that you were doing anything wrong, but did you worry about Tiffany's estate, family, whatever, coming to say anything, or, in any way?
No, I really did not. I decided that I was not going to reach. I very much admired the biography that Michael Burlingham, who is Dorothy Burlingham's grandson, wrote a wonderful biography called The Last Tiffany about Dorothy Burlingham that I relied on very heavily. And it crossed my mind to contact him while I was in the middle of doing the work too. Yeah. And I decided not to because I thought, I am then going to feel in some kind of way emotionally indebted to him, and I didn't want to feel. I felt like I wanted to be able to depict her without worrying about some kind of loyalty to him. And the question of whether or not Dorothy Burlingham actually had a love relationship with Anna Freud is one that's been long debated. And in the book, in his biography, he leaves that question very open. But in the last 4 or 5 years, in talks that he's given, he's acknowledged the evidence is probably that their marriage was more physical than a, quote, Boston marriage was.
Okay. And, wait, so have you heard from any of the family or no?
No, I never did.
Okay. Interesting. Which is so interesting to me because that's one of my, just going back to sort of the ethics of fiction and who you feel a moral obligation to in telling their stories. I obviously feel that way for the special needs parents and, immigrants and things like that as, representatives of the larger community of those types of the people who are in those communities. And it just, I sort of still read through all the Goodreads reviews and Amazon reviews and stuff like that, looking for those that are specifically from the people with those experiences from the communities, either like, special needs parents themselves or, somebody who is a sibling or something like that. Because I think their reviews and the way that they read the story is just so interesting to me, and it's something that I care about. Like as an author, I probably shouldn't read any of the reader reviews, and I've been told by all of my author friends never to go on Goodreads. but I just can't help it. I love just trying to, good or bad. Like I want to know what they have to say, and I want to make sure that, if there is a complaint or a compliment either, that I want to sort of, think about that, because I think that that's important, how our work influences the communities that we're writing about. So
I wanted to ask you
now,
about the, let me ask you a quick question just on that before we turn it over.
Yeah.
So you also depict the protesters. So in your novel, there are a group of parents who are protesting the parents of particularly autistic children who are trying to treat them, saying their argument is that the autistic children, there's nothing wrong with them and they shouldn't be, quote, treated. And is that a real community, and how did they respond? They are less sympathetically, I think, depicted in your book, and I'm just wondering what your feelings were about that.
Definitely. And I think, there are definitely some of these one-star reviews that I've read that, say the book is ableist because it does, I think, more favorably portray parents of special needs kids, and the parents who sort of, are frustrated by some of their circumstances and want to pursue treatment for them. And there's a group of readers out there who think that's not the way it should be, and that's, like parents should accept, children with autism or cerebral palsy or whatever it is, and just for who they are, and not try to pursue quote unquote treatments or cures for them, and that's really awful. And so I think there's definitely that community out there, and I've definitely talked to them about it, and I've definitely talked to them in real life about it. And so these are the kinds of things that I think are really interesting, that fiction can raise, the questions that we can raise for these communities. And it is definitely something that I heard about and encountered in doing HBOT for my own child, and in talking with my very close friends who have children with autism and cerebral palsy, that they've been criticized for trying to pursue, therapies for them to help them to, get quote unquote better, whatever that means, as far as like, getting their nonverbal kids to, learn to communicate and things like that. So it's definitely an issue that's out there, and it's definitely something that I've thought about a lot. And because I have 7 point of view characters in my novel, and they're all people who are related to the HBOT community. And so I don't have any chapters from the perspectives of the protesters. And so I think because of that, and I think because we always I think we feel more empathy towards the characters that we have this intimate connection with by virtue of hearing directly from their voices. And so because we don't have that from the protesters group, we sort of think of them more as, the evil antagonist of the story. And, which I didn't really think about, but I now realize that's how it comes across. So I think it's just really interesting to think about for future stories, how the choice of whose voices you choose to highlight can by themselves influence the way that the story gets perceived, and who the heroes are, and who the enemies are, and who the bad guys are, and all of that sort of stuff. So it's so interesting, just because, like the more you hear, even if somebody does something that seems on the surface to be despicable, if you get an understanding through a very close third, or first person narrative, then maybe you come to understand that in a way that you wouldn't if you never heard from them. So. Yeah. So should we ask for?
Yeah, let's.
So
question,
everyone, we
for
have
sure.
like a little bit of time left. We've been gathering with each other, but if you have any questions whatsoever, please, please, please put in the chat or in the questions, whatever you would like. And until we come to that, I just wanted to ask you, Lisa, how the quarantine is going for you. How are things? How is writing? Are you writing? What's the creative process like, and how is it different now rather than, before this crazy new world?
Well, that's a good question. The quarantine is so different for every person. As a writer, I was already used to spending a lot of time alone, and in fact, I have less time alone than ever because now my family is all home all the time. And
yeah,
but some people have felt so distracted. Some writer friends I know that they've had trouble working. For me, working has been maybe the only hours of the day that I feel real relief. It's kind of a yoga for the mind. I'm able to focus and concentrate fully, not for very long, and that's mostly because daily life, the exigencies of daily life take up more of my time than usual, but so I have fewer hours. I feel busier than I usually am. How about for you? How's it going for you?
I'm working on my second novel, and unlike my first novel, unlike with Miracle Creek, I do feel like, okay, this probably is going to become a real novel. It's probably going to become a book. And so it's funny. I need you to be like my therapist or something, Lisa, because I'm feeling something about that pressure, and I hear from a lot of my friends about sort of the sophomore slump and all of that stuff, usually in the context of, oh, don't worry about the sophomore slump. It doesn't really exist, which doesn't really make me feel any better. And so I'm feeling a little bit more sort of stressed about the fact that for my second novel, I don't really have it all planned out, which is the same process that I had for Miracle Creek. So in some ways, it should be comforting, and yet I feel it very stressful that I don't know everything, just because it's hard to sort of compare me now to me, like 7 years ago when I started writing Miracle Creek, and sort of try to comfort myself that I went through this once and I can do it again. Because now all I can see is this beautiful book in front of me and that's a finished product, and feel like, okay, I have no idea what's going to happen to any of these characters that I'm writing about now. So how is this ever going to become a book, a finished product? So I think that's so interesting. Okay, so we have a couple of questions, Lisa. Okay, so I'll take them in order. So Mike asked a question for me. Do I regret not putting in the perspective of the protesters? Maybe. I do think that at some point I had to sort of, not make this a 500-page novel. I remember the last editing thing that we did, it was like 145,000 words, and I cut it down to 115,000 words, which I thought was, pretty good. And if I had put in the perspectives of the protesters, it probably would have ballooned even further. But I do think that now that I'm thinking back on it, I wonder if that might have been an interesting choice to make. Just because I do think that whenever people are vilified, I find those people the most interesting in any story that I read or, watch on TV or in a movie or whatever. And given that probably the protesters are sort of the closest to villains in my story, I think that I don't like that I have people who are a little more flat and more sort of one-note villainy in my novel, which I didn't really think about until it was out there. And that was, so I do think that in some ways that I had done that. And Another feedback that I've seen from some of the readers is that it would have been nice to hear from the kids rather than just the parents. And to which I say, like, this is, to me, Miracle Creek is about parenting sacrifice. It's about sacrifices that parents make, whether it be, immigration, like, moving your entire family, and, letting go of your entire life, or, really devoting your entire days, like 24/7, to children with special needs. It's about being a parent and what that entails. And in a similar way, sort of, I think the novel that I'm working on right now is almost like a companion to Miracle Creek, in the sense that it's actually really the story from the kid's perspective, both sort of a kid with special needs and siblings of, that kid, and really doesn't focus as much on the parents. So I do think that in some ways, I like focusing in on these things and, really looking at different sides of that same perspective.
So you do have Mary. You do have Mary.
I do. I do have Mary, who's 16. Although I added Mary because my agent really wanted me to.
I didn't know that.
So she was a last minute addition. So yeah.
So she was in the story, but not a point of view character. You mean originally?
Right. Exactly. Originally. Exactly. So that's right. Isn't that interesting that I didn't have, her or any other non-parents in the beginning? Okay, so we also have a question from Nancy that I think is going to be our last question before we have to get off. So Nancy asks, and you can take this one, Lisa, how are you dealing with the complication of writing a contemporary story given our current reality? Ignore the coronavirus, include it, or what? Oh my God, such a good question, Nancy.
Good question,
such
Nancy.
A good question. Okay.
Well, I've read in the past week or so 2 novels in which September 11 is talked about. And it's just starting to seem like that's even possible to do it. It's often my feeling that when something happens, you really have to allow a lot of time to pass before you can write about it in a meaningful way. I think what's different about COVID is that, not to say that 9/11 wasn't hugely traumatic and one of those juncture points in people's lives, like the Kennedy assassination, where people are always going to remember where they were, that it didn't affect everyone in the entire country. It didn't change the whole fabric of the way we live. It was very psychologically traumatic, but about a month later, we were more or less going back to how we'd always lived. Of course, yes, in the airports, things were different and so on, but there were federal buildings or different kind of security. Now, I think many people are just wondering what is life going to be like going forward.
Yeah.
So I don't really feel ready to write about it yet. But in the book I'm working on now, as I think ahead, I'm aware that if the book moves beyond 2020, which I intended to, because it's a follow-up on something and it wants to go beyond 2020, that I will have to deal with COVID because it will have changed the fabric of everybody's life. And so I'm not sure how I'm going to do that yet. And I don't think any of us really know what's going to happen. It's hard to imagine. Like even in May, we didn't know, are we going to, will the kids go back to school in September? Now it's starting to look like they most likely will, but things are changing very fast. And so I don't know that's an answer. How about you? Is it relevant for you, Angie, your book?
I think so. I mean, I'm not sure. So, I think it's different from 9/11 in a couple of ways. I think 9/11, you can't really write about 9/11 without sort of writing about sort of the trauma of that actual event. And I think with COVID and the quarantine, it's a little bit different in that, yes, there's the sort of, trauma of it, and there are a lot of like sort of things that characters can be thinking about it that shapes the way that they think about the world. But I think more, I wonder, like, how are we going to deal with the day-to-dayness of the quarantine situation and social distancing and all of those things? It's almost like the advent of like email or, smartphones or things like that, where if you have a story that's set in a certain era that's post-smartphones, then it really, like, especially for mysteries and things like that, it really limits the things that you can do or should do from a logistics perspective. Like, you have to have, characters that text, and, you need to be able to, like, look at GPS and, all of that sort of stuff. And I think in the same way, if you're going to have something be set, like, for now or next year or whatever, you have to think about, like, things like masks and, are restaurants open, and, those types of day-to-day things. But I'm not sure that you need to think more about sort of the trauma of the event itself in the same way that you do if you have a novel about 9/11, say. You see what I'm saying?
The analogy with smartphones is really apt. I know several writers who've decided to set their novels before 2008 because they just did not want to have texting. And it's even more than that. It's not just the technology. It's actually people's consciousness have really changed in the last 10 years, particularly young people, and what social media means to them and the way they interact with each other and so on. And I think we're at time, Angie.
Yeah, I know we are. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is so wonderful. I love Belmont so much. So thank you. And thank you
Emma and Belmont
inviting
Books.
us. Yay!
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming and for chatting. It was really interesting, and I hope everyone in the chat enjoyed it. I know I did. So thank you both for being here, and I hope we can have another event with you guys soon.
That would be great. I can't wait
that.
until this is all over and we can travel so we can come, like, in person to your wonderful store.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for coming.
And thank you everyone for coming. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.